John Carter was once an ordinary man, living a simple yet meaningful life. He was a civil engineer, respected by his colleagues and friends for his honesty and dedication to his work. With a small family consisting of his wife and a 5-year-old daughter, John's life seemed perfect. He always believed that as long as he lived with integrity, good things would come his way. But life is not always fair. One day, tragedy struck when John was accused of participating in an armed robbery that resulted in the death of an innocent person. Although he had an alibi, false testimonies and the manipulation of certain powerful individuals led to his conviction. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison. The trial was swift, and all of John's defenses were dismissed. He not only lost his freedom but also his faith in the justice system he once respected. On the day he was taken to prison, John felt as though his entire world had collapsed. He saw the tearful eyes of his wife and daughter through the glass of the courtroom. They could do nothing to save him. A deep pain welled up inside him, but he told himself he had to survive, not just to prove his innocence but also to protect his family from further harm. The prison where John was sent was a harsh and notorious place, infamous for its brutality and corruption. From the moment he stepped through the heavy iron gates, John could feel the oppressive and threatening atmosphere. The gray walls, the echoing screams from the cells, and the cold stares of the guards made it clear that this was not just a place to hold criminals, it was a living hell. Marcus, the warden, was the man in charge. He was a large, imposing figure with a cold, sharp gaze. Marcus was not only known for his cruelty, but also for his ability to manipulate everything within the prison. He ran the place like his own kingdom, where the law had no place. Marcus frequently exploited the prisoners, forcing them into hard labor on secret projects outside the prison to line his own pockets. Henry, the deputy warden and Marcus's right-hand man, was just as ruthless and cunning. Henry not only followed Marcus's every order, but also devised his own ways to punish prisoners, satisfying his twisted sense of power. He often beat prisoners without reason, using his authority to intimidate and coerce them into doing illegal tasks. To Henry, prisoners were not human beings but tools to assert his dominance. From the very beginning, John became a target for Marcus and Henry. They disliked his silence and unyielding demeanor. Marcus often mocked John, calling him naive for believing in justice. "Here, justice is whatever I decide it is," Marcus once sneered at John. Henry, on the other hand, didn't hesitate to use violence to teach John, forcing him to follow the prison's unwritten rules. John quickly realized that to survive in this prison, he couldn't rely solely on his principles. He had to learn to observe, remember, and wait for the right moment. Every day, he witnessed the corrupt actions of Marcus and Henry. They not only exploited the prisoners but also embezzled funds meant for the prison, selling food and supplies meant for the inmates to outsiders for profit. Any prisoner who dared to resist was severely punished, often thrown into solitary confinement for weeks. John also noticed that not all the guards were like Marcus and Henry. Some, though too afraid to openly oppose Marcus, quietly helped the prisoners when they could. John began to build relationships with these individuals, listening to their stories and remembering important details. He knew that one day this information would be useful. Meanwhile, John also tried to help other prisoners. He saw that many of them were not truly bad people, but victims of circumstance. Some had been forced into crime, while others, like him, had been wrongfully convicted. John became a friend, a listener, and sometimes a protector for the weaker inmates. He helped them get through the tough days while silently documenting the injustices they endured. Despite the harsh and dangerous life in prison, John never gave up hope. He believed that the truth would eventually come to light and that justice would prevail. Every night, as he lay on the hard bed in his cell, he reminded himself that he had to survive, not just for himself but for his family. The image of his wife and daughter was always his greatest source of strength. John also began keeping a journal, recording everything he witnessed and experienced in prison. He knew that these pages could one day serve as crucial evidence to expose the truth about the prison and the people running it. Every word he wrote carried his determination and belief in a better tomorrow. The days in prison were not just a time of suffering, but also a journey of growth and resilience for John. He learned patience, how to face adversity, and how to hold on to his beliefs in the darkest of times. Even though Marcus and Henry punished him repeatedly, he never gave in. John's steadfastness not only earned the respect of other prisoners, but also made Marcus and Henry uneasy. John knew he couldn't change everything overnight, But he believed that every small action, every bit of help he gave to others, was a step toward justice. And no matter how long it took, he was ready to fight for the values he believed in. 5 years in prison was a long time, enough to change a person forever. For John Carter, those years were filled with suffering, but they were also a time for him to cultivate patience, determination, and faith in justice. The day he was exonerated and released felt like the world had finally opened up again. The sky seemed brighter, the air fresher, and the outside world like a dream he had longed for during his years of confinement. But freedom was not just about walking out of the prison gates. For John, freedom was also the chance to start over, to fight for the truth, and to protect the weak. The news of John's exoneration came like a ray of light in the darkness. A new witness had come forward, providing crucial evidence that proved John had no involvement in the robbery he was accused of. The false testimonies from the past were exposed, and the people behind the conspiracy to frame him began to surface. After months of reinvestigating the case, the court finally declared John innocent and ordered his immediate release. The day he walked out of the prison gates, John felt as though he had just escaped a nightmare. He stood still, taking a deep breath, feeling the warm sunlight on his skin and the wind brushing past his ears. But his joy was incomplete. 5 years of wrongful imprisonment had taken so much from him. Time with his family, his career, and his faith in the legal system he once respected. He knew he couldn't return to his old life as if nothing had happened. He had to do something to make a difference, not just for himself, but for others as well. John's wife and daughter were waiting for him outside. His daughter, now 10 years old, ran to him and hugged him tightly, tears streaming down her face. "Daddy, you're finally home," she said, her voice choked with emotion. John held her close, feeling the love and forgiveness in her small embrace. His wife, who had endured years of hardship, stood there smiling at him. "We'll start over, John," she said, her voice filled with determination. "Our family will get through this." In the first few days after his release, John felt lost. He didn't know where to begin. The memories of prison, of the injustices he had endured, haunted him every night. But instead of letting the pain consume him, John decided to turn it into motivation. He knew he couldn't change the past, but he could do something to prevent similar tragedies from happening to others. John began studying law. He wanted to understand the system that had made him a victim, and more importantly, he wanted to find ways to fix its flaws. He enrolled in a law school, knowing full well that studying at his age would not be easy. But for John, this wasn't just about learning. It was a mission. He wanted to become someone who could fight for justice, not just with words, but with actions. During his time in law school, John also joined human rights organizations. He met people who shared his vision, individuals who had dedicated their lives to protecting the rights of the vulnerable. They listened to his story, admired his resilience, and invited him to join their projects. John began traveling, sharing his story, talking about the injustices he had witnessed in prison, and calling on others to take action for change. These journeys not only helped John regain his faith in humanity, but also made him realize that he was not alone. There were many people out there fighting for justice, and he wanted to be part of that movement. He started writing articles, participating in conferences, and even appearing on television to discuss issues in the legal and prison systems. Gradually, John became a voice of influence, a symbol of resilience and determination. One day, while attending a conference on prison reform, John received an unexpected offer. A high-ranking government official, who had been following John's journey since his exoneration, approached him after the event. "John," the official said, "I've heard your story, and I believe you're someone who can bring real change. We're looking for a new director for the prison where you were once held. Would you consider taking the job?" John was stunned. The thought of returning to the place that had imprisoned him, where he had endured so much suffering, filled him with both fear and excitement. But after a moment of reflection, he realized that this was the opportunity he had been searching for. If he wanted to change the system, he had to start from within, and there was no better place to begin than the very prison that had once been his personal hell. "Yes," John replied, his voice firm. "I'll take the job, but I have one condition. I want full authority to implement the reforms I believe are necessary." The official smiled. "We trust you, John. Do what you think is right." The day John returned to the prison, this time as its director, was an emotional one. He walked through the heavy iron gates, the same gates he had entered 5 years earlier as a prisoner. The gray walls, the cold hallways, and the echoing screams from the cells were still there, but this time John was no longer a victim. He was someone with the power to make a difference. The old guards, including Marcus and Henry, couldn't hide their surprise and unease when they saw John. They knew that his return could mean the end of their corrupt practices, but John didn't rush to confront them. He knew that to implement the changes he envisioned, he needed time and the support of others. John started by listening. He met with prisoners, guards, and even the administrative staff of the prison. He wanted to understand the problems they were facing and find fair solutions. He also began drafting reform plans, from improving living conditions for inmates to establishing education and vocational training programs. Gradually, John gained the support of many. The prisoners began to trust him, the honest guards felt encouraged, and even those who had doubted him had to admit that he was doing the right thing. But John knew that his journey had only just begun. Greater challenges still lay ahead. John Carter had stepped out of the shadows of his past to embark on a new journey. From a man wrongfully convicted, he had become a symbol of resilience and determination. And now, as the director of the prison, he was ready to face the challenges ahead to fulfill his mission, to bring justice and hope to those who had been forgotten. The day John Carter walked through the heavy iron gates of the prison as its new director, the atmosphere inside seemed to freeze. The gray walls, the cold hallways, and the echoing screams from the cells remained unchanged. But this time, John was no longer a prisoner. He was the one in charge, the one with the power to make a difference. His return was not just an unexpected event, but a major shock to those who had once manipulated and abused their power in this prison. Marcus, the former head warden, and Henry, the deputy warden, couldn't believe their eyes when they saw John step into the director's office. They had once thought John would never leave this prison, let alone return as its leader. His presence sent waves of panic through them because they knew exactly what they had done in the past. Their corruption, exploitation, and abuse of prisoners were now at risk of being exposed. Marcus, with his large frame and cold demeanor, tried to maintain his composure. He stepped forward to greet John, forcing a strained smile. "Welcome back, Director Carter," Marcus said, his voice attempting to sound friendly but betraying his unease. "I didn't expect you to take this job, but I'm sure we'll work well together." Henry, standing behind Marcus, couldn't hide his nervousness. He glanced at John, his eyes filled with suspicion and fear. He knew John wasn't the type to forget what had happened, but what unsettled Henry the most was John's silence. He didn't show anger or resentment. Instead, he remained calm, as if he were waiting for something. "That's right," John replied, his voice steady and firm. "I didn't expect to return here either, but I believe we can work together to make this place better, not just for the prisoners, but for everyone." John's words only deepened Marcus and Henry's anxiety. They had no idea what he was thinking, and that made them feel even more uneasy. Over the years, they had grown accustomed to controlling everything in this prison. But now, with John's return, they felt their power slipping away. Even though John was fully aware of what Marcus and Henry had done, he didn't rush to confront them. He understood that to implement the reforms he envisioned, he needed time and the support of others. Acting too quickly could provoke resistance from Marcus and Henry, making things even more difficult. Instead, John began by observing. He spent his first days walking around the prison, talking to prisoners, guards, and administrative staff. He wanted to gain a deeper understanding of the current situation, the problems people were facing, and how the system had been operating over the years. John also paid close attention to Marcus and Henry's behavior. He noticed that they were trying to cover up their past wrongdoings. Marcus frequently held meetings with the guards, reminding them to be careful and not reveal any information that could incriminate him. Henry, on the other hand, became more discreet, avoiding direct contact with John and always appearing busy. But John didn't show any signs of suspicion. He remained calm, listening and observing. He knew that to dismantle a corrupt system, he needed to understand how it worked, and to do that, he needed time. After weeks of observation, John began drafting plans to reform the prison. He knew that to change this place, he couldn't rely solely on his authority. He needed the support of the prisoners, the honest guards, and even people in the government. John started by improving the living conditions of the prisoners. He noticed that many of them weren't provided with enough food, clean water, or basic necessities. He ordered an increase in food rations, improved the quality of meals, and ensured that all prisoners had access to clean water. These small changes made a big difference. The prisoners began to feel like they were being treated as human beings, and this gave them a sense of trust in John. Next, John established education and vocational training programs for the prisoners. He believed that to help them reintegrate into society after their release, they needed knowledge and skills. He invited teachers and experts to the prison to provide lessons, and he encouraged the prisoners to participate in these activities. Gradually, the atmosphere in the prison began to change. The prisoners no longer felt as hopeless as before, and they started to have hope for a better future. John also focused on the guards. He knew that not all of them were like Marcus and Henry. Some genuinely wanted to do the right thing, but were held back by the corrupt system. John began building relationships with these individuals, listening to their stories, and encouraging them to support his reform plans. He also organized training sessions to help the guards better understand their rights and responsibilities, as well as how to treat prisoners fairly. The changes John implemented didn't happen overnight. At first, Marcus and Henry tried to obstruct him, using their influence to slow down the progress of his reforms. But John didn't give up. He knew that changing a system that had existed for years required patience and determination. Gradually, John's efforts began to bear fruit. The prisoners started to trust him, the honest guards felt encouraged, and even those who had doubted him had to admit that he was doing the right thing. But John knew that his journey was just beginning. Greater challenges still lay ahead. John Carter had returned to the place that had once been his hell, but this time he was no longer a victim. He was someone with the power to make a difference, and he was ready to face any difficulty to fulfill his mission, to transform this prison into a place of fairness and humanity. His calmness and determination not only unsettled Marcus and Henry, but also inspired others. And though the road ahead was still full of obstacles, John knew he was on the right path. John Carter knew that to change a system that had rotted from the inside, he couldn't rely solely on his authority. He needed the support of both the prisoners and the honest guards. Above all, he needed to listen. He understood that real reform had to start with understanding the injustices people had endured. So the first step in John's reform plan was to organize meetings with the prisoners. John decided to hold direct meetings with groups of prisoners. He wanted to hear their stories, the injustices they had suffered, and their hopes for a better life. These meetings didn't take place in the cold, formal director's office, but in a small room in the common area of the prison. John wanted to create a space where they felt safe to speak the truth. At first, many prisoners were skeptical. They were used to being treated as numbers, not as people. They didn't believe that a prison director, especially someone who had once been a prisoner like John, truly cared about them. But as John sat down, listened to them without interrupting or judging, their doubts began to fade. A prisoner named Carlos, who had been incarcerated for over 10 years, shared how he had been beaten by guards when he refused to participate in forced labor. "They said I had no right to refuse," Carlos said bitterly. "They took away my food and locked me in solitary confinement for a week. I wasn't the only one. Many others went through the same thing." Another prisoner, a woman named Maria, spoke about being denied medical care when she was seriously ill. "They said I was faking it to avoid work," Maria said, tears streaming down her face. "I almost died from a high fever. If it weren't for another prisoner helping me, I don't know if I'd still be alive today." Stories like these broke John's heart, but he didn't let his emotions overwhelm him. He carefully documented every detail, every word. He knew these stories weren't just evidence of injustice, but also the foundation for building his reform plans. After listening to the prisoners' stories, John realized that one of the main reasons they had fallen into a cycle of crime was the lack of opportunities and skills to lead an honest life. So he decided to implement education and vocational training programs in the prison. John invited teachers and experts from outside to conduct classes. He set up literacy programs for prisoners who couldn't read or write. He also organized vocational training courses in fields like machinery repair, cooking, and even computer programming. These courses not only gave the prisoners new skills, but also gave them hope for a better future. A young prisoner named David, who had been convicted of theft, joined a machinery repair class. "I never thought I could do something good," David told John during one of their meetings, "but now I feel like I can change. I want to turn my life around." John also encouraged prisoners to participate in creative activities like writing, painting, and music. He believed that art could help them express their emotions and find peace within themselves. Some prisoners, who had once felt hopeless, began to find joy in these activities. The atmosphere in the prison gradually became lighter and less tense. John knew that to prevent abuse of power and ensure that his reforms were implemented fairly, he needed an independent oversight mechanism. So he decided to establish an oversight committee made up of members from outside the prison. This committee was tasked with monitoring the prison's activities, hearing complaints from prisoners, and ensuring that their rights were protected. John invited lawyers, human rights activists, and even former prisoners to join the committee. He wanted to ensure that the committee was not influenced by people like Marcus and Henry. The committee was given access to all areas of the prison, from the cells to the guards' workspaces. They were also allowed to hold private meetings with prisoners to hear their concerns. The presence of the oversight committee made Marcus and Henry extremely anxious. They knew that their past wrongdoings could be exposed at any moment. But John didn't care about their anxiety. He was focused solely on building a transparent and fair system. John's efforts began to gain the support of some honest guards. These individuals, who had previously been suppressed by Marcus and Henry, now felt encouraged by John's leadership. They started participating in the reform plans, helping prisoners, and reporting any misconduct they witnessed. A guard named Thomas, who had worked in the prison for over 15 years, approached John and said, "I've seen too many wrong things happen here, but I was too afraid to speak up because I didn't want to lose my job. But now, I believe you truly want to change this place. I'll do everything I can to help you." However, not everyone supported John. Marcus and Henry, though they didn't dare openly oppose him, quietly worked to undermine him. They used their influence to create obstacles for the reform programs, from delaying the delivery of materials for the classes to spreading rumors to damage John's credibility. Once Marcus deliberately held a meeting with the guards, claiming that John's reforms were unrealistic and would lead to a loss of control in the prison. But his words no longer carried the weight they once did. Many guards who had witnessed the positive changes in the prison began to side with John. Despite facing many challenges, John didn't lose heart. He knew that the path to reform wouldn't be easy, but he believed that his efforts would pay off. He continued to work tirelessly, listening, learning, and adjusting his plans to fit the reality of the situation. The changes John brought not only improved the lives of the prisoners, but also created a better working environment for the honest guards. Gradually, the atmosphere in the prison became lighter and less tense. But John knew that his journey had only just begun. Greater challenges still lay ahead. John Carter, once a man wrongfully imprisoned, had now become a beacon of hope for those who had been forgotten. He wasn't just changing the prison, he was changing the way people thought about justice and human rights. And though the road ahead was still full of obstacles, John knew he was on the right path. John Carter knew that to implement lasting and sustainable reforms, he couldn't allow people like Marcus and Henry to remain in the system. Although he didn't openly confront them at first, John was always quietly observing and investigating. He understood that to dismantle their power, he needed undeniable evidence of the corruption and abuse of power they had committed over the years. This wasn't just a fight for justice, but also a necessary step to protect the reforms he had worked so hard to establish. John began his investigation discreetly. He knew that if Marcus and Henry found out, they would try to cover their tracks and might even pose a danger to him. Therefore, he used the relationships he had built within the prison, from prisoners to honest guards, to gather information. John frequently spoke with prisoners, especially those who had been mistreated by Marcus and Henry. He listened to their stories and carefully documented every detail. Some prisoners revealed that they had been forced into grueling labor under extremely harsh conditions. They were made to work on secret construction projects outside the prison, unpaid, and if they refused, they were beaten or thrown into solitary confinement. A prisoner named Luis recounted, "They took us out at night and made us work until we were exhausted. We built buildings, transported materials, but no one knew who those projects were for. Marcus and Henry were always watching, and anyone who dared to resist was severely punished." It wasn't just the prisoners. Some honest guards also began providing information to John. They revealed that Marcus and Henry had exploited their positions to profit personally. They sold supplies meant for the prison, from food to medicine to outside buyers for money. Items that should have been used to improve the lives of prisoners instead became a source of illicit income for them. A guard named Thomas, who had previously expressed his support for John, said, "I've seen them move goods out at night. trucks loaded with food and medical supplies, but they never reached the prisoners. I didn't dare say anything because I was afraid of retaliation, but now I believe you can do something to stop this." Over weeks of investigation, John gradually pieced together the puzzle. He discovered that Marcus and Henry were not only corrupt, but also running a large-scale forced labor network. They had been using prisoners as tools to generate profit, forcing them to work on secret construction projects and selling their labor to outside companies. These companies, eager to save costs, turned a blind eye to the illegal activities of Marcus and Henry. John also uncovered evidence of Marcus and Henry accepting bribes from wealthy prisoners or their families. In return, they provided these prisoners with privileges such as better cells, better food, or even reduced sentences. Meanwhile, poorer prisoners or those without outside support were left to endure terrible living conditions and unfair treatment. One of John's most serious discoveries was that Marcus and Henry had deliberately covered up incidents of violence within the prison. Prisoners who were beaten or even killed due to violence were never reported. Instead, they falsified reports claiming that these prisoners had died from illness or accidents. John knew that these actions were not only unethical but also serious crimes. When John had gathered enough evidence, he realized he couldn't act alone. He needed external support to ensure that what he had uncovered would be handled fairly and transparently. So he reached out to human rights organizations he had worked with in the past. He shared with them the evidence he had collected, from prisoner testimonies to documents and photos he had secretly obtained. The human rights organizations immediately expressed their interest and willingness to support John. They sent lawyers and investigators to the prison to work with him. These experts not only helped John verify the evidence, but also guided him on how to present it to the authorities and the public. John also contacted some officials in the government whom he believed would support his fight against corruption. He knew that to bring down Marcus and Henry, he needed intervention from higher authorities. Some officials, after reviewing the evidence John provided, pledged to support him in bringing the perpetrators to justice. John knew that the confrontation with Marcus and Henry wouldn't be easy. They had built their power in the prison over many years, and they wouldn't give it up without a fight. But John wasn't afraid. He believed that truth and justice would prevail. He began preparing for the confrontation by solidifying the support of prisoners and honest guards. He held private meetings to inform them of what he had discovered and his plans. He emphasized that this wasn't just his fight, but a fight for everyone in the prison who wanted to see real change. John also worked closely with human rights organizations and government officials to plan their actions. They decided that when the time was right, they would make all the evidence public and demand a full investigation into the prison. John knew this would cause a major shock, not just within the prison, but throughout the entire justice system. Meanwhile, Marcus and Henry began to sense that something was wrong. They noticed that John was becoming more confident and assertive. They tried to figure out what he was doing, but John kept everything a secret. Their anxiety grew, but they didn't know that their time was running out. John Carter was ready for the biggest battle of his life. He didn't just want to bring down Marcus and Henry. He wanted to send a powerful message to everyone abusing their power. The truth will always come to light. And though the road ahead was still full of challenges, John knew he wasn't alone. He had the support of those who believed in justice, and that was enough to keep him moving forward. Marcus and Henry, after weeks of anxiety and suspicion, finally realized that John Carter was quietly investigating and gathering evidence against them. John's actions, from organizing meetings with prisoners to collaborating with human rights organizations, had made it impossible for them to remain idle. They understood that if they didn't act quickly, the power and illicit benefits they had built over the years would collapse. So Marcus and Henry decided to fight back, using every tactic at their disposal to protect their positions. The first step in Marcus and Henry's plan was to tarnish John's reputation. They knew that if they could undermine his credibility in the eyes of the prisoners, guards, and authorities, they might have a chance to stop the reforms he was implementing. Marcus and Henry began spreading malicious rumors about John, claiming that he was only using his position to serve his own personal agenda. They spread lies that John was using the reform programs as a cover for his own corruption. Some guards loyal to Marcus and Henry joined the campaign, spreading false claims that John had accepted bribes from prisoners in exchange for special privileges. These rumors quickly spread throughout the prison, causing some prisoners and guards to start doubting John. A prisoner named Carlos, who had once supported John, approached him and asked, Is it true what they're saying? Are you just using us to get what you want? John, though hurt by the suspicion, calmly replied, Carlos, I can't control what they say, but I can control what I do. Look at what I've done, not what they say about me. Gradually, John's words and his actions helped him regain the trust of those around him. However, Marcus and Henry didn't stop there. They decided to escalate their efforts by resorting to more dangerous measures. Realizing that their smear campaign wasn't enough to stop John, Marcus and Henry moved on to a more brutal plan. They hired a group of outsiders to threaten John's life. One night, as John was driving home after a meeting with human rights organizations, he noticed a strange car following him. The car deliberately tried to force him off the road, making him stop. A man stepped out holding a knife and said, If you don't stop what you're doing, next time it won't just be a warning. John, though aware of the danger, remained calm. He knew this was part of Marcus and Henry's plan to intimidate him into giving up, but instead of backing down, he decided to strengthen security measures for himself and his family. He reported the incident to the authorities and human rights organizations, requesting their protection. Not only that, but John also used this threat to reinforce his determination. He told his supporters, if they have to resort to violence to stop me, it only proves that they're afraid. And if they're afraid, it means we're on the right path. After weeks of preparation, John decided it was time to make all the evidence he had gathered public. He knew this would be a dangerous move, but he also understood that only transparency could force Marcus and Henry to face justice. He organized a large meeting, inviting all prison staff, representatives from human rights organizations, and government officials to attend. At the meeting, John presented the evidence he had collected in a detailed and clear manner. He began by showing videos and photos documenting prisoners being forced into hard labor under the supervision of Marcus and Henry. He also presented documents proving that they had accepted bribes and sold prison supplies for personal profit. John didn't stop at presenting evidence. He also invited several prisoners and honest guards to speak. These individuals, after being assured of their safety, shared what they had witnessed and experienced under Marcus and Henry's rule. A prisoner named Luis said, I was forced to work until I was exhausted, and if I refused, they would beat me. But today, I stand here to tell the truth because I believe John Carter will bring justice. The atmosphere in the room grew tense as John concluded his presentation. Marcus and Henry, sitting at the back of the room, tried to maintain their composure but couldn't hide their anxiety. Some government officials immediately called for a full investigation into the allegations John had made. Under pressure from human rights organizations and the government, Marcus and Henry had no choice but to face the law. An official investigation was launched, and the evidence John provided was quickly verified. Investigators discovered that Marcus and Henry had been involved in a series of illegal activities, from corruption to violence and abuse of power. Both were immediately suspended from their positions and arrested for further investigation. As they were handcuffed and led away, Marcus turned to look at John with hatred in his eyes, but John responded with a steady gaze. He knew this wasn't just his victory, but a victory for everyone who had endured injustice in the prison. After Marcus and Henry were arrested, the atmosphere in the prison changed significantly. Prisoners who had lived in fear now felt safer. Honest guards who had been suppressed by Marcus and Henry's power could now work more fairly and transparently. John, though aware that the fight against injustice was far from over, felt relieved to have overcome one of the greatest challenges. He continued working with human rights organizations and the government to ensure that his reforms would be implemented sustainably. John Carter, once a man wrongfully imprisoned, had now become a symbol of resilience and justice. He had not only changed the prison, but also changed the way people viewed power and responsibility. And though the road ahead remained difficult, John knew he had laid a solid foundation for a better future. Marcus and Henry, two men who once held absolute power in the prison, now had to face the consequences of their brutality and corruption. After their arrest, they were subjected to a thorough investigation, during which all their crimes were gradually brought to light. For John Carter, this was not just a personal victory, but also a pivotal moment in his journey to reform the prison. However, he knew his work was far from over. Removing Marcus and Henry was only the beginning. He had a greater mission: to transform the prison into a place that truly helped inmates reintegrate into society and rebuild their lives. Immediately after their arrest, Marcus and Henry were detained for investigation. The evidence John had gathered, ranging from prisoner testimonies and statements from honest guards to documents and photographs, was irrefutable. The investigation quickly revealed the scale of their corruption and abuse of power. Marcus and Henry had not only forced prisoners into grueling labor for personal profit, but also accepted bribes, sold prison supplies, and covered up serious incidents of violence. During interrogations, both men tried to deny all accusations, but the overwhelming evidence left them with no way out. Some guards who had been their accomplices confessed the truth in exchange for lighter sentences. These confessions further solidified the charges against Marcus and Henry. The trial of Marcus and Henry became a major event, drawing the attention of the public and human rights organizations. During the trial, prisoners who had suffered under their rule stood up to testify, recounting the horrors they had endured. One prisoner said, "They treated us like tools, not humans. But thanks to John Carter, we finally have the chance to speak the truth." In the end, Marcus and Henry were convicted of multiple charges, including corruption, abuse of power, and human rights violations. They were sentenced to many years in prison, bringing an end to their reign of terror. As they were led away in handcuffs, Marcus and Henry no longer carried their usual arrogance. They bowed their heads, knowing their time of dominance was over. With Marcus and Henry gone, John Carter could focus all his energy on reforming the prison. He understood that real change required building a system that not only punished, but also helped inmates reintegrate into society. John believed that if the prison was merely a place of confinement and punishment, those who left would have no chance to rebuild their lives, and the cycle of crime would continue. John began by improving living conditions in the prison. He ensured that all inmates were provided with adequate food, water, and medical care. The overcrowded, filthy cells were repaired and cleaned. He also established strict regulations to prevent violence between inmates and between guards and inmates. Guards who had participated in violent or corrupt acts were dismissed, while honest ones were encouraged to continue their work. One of the most important reforms John implemented was the introduction of education and vocational training programs for inmates. He invited teachers and experts from outside to teach, helping inmates learn to read, write, and develop skills necessary for finding jobs after their release. Inmates with special talents were encouraged to take advanced courses, giving them the opportunity to build a better future. John also set up psychological counseling programs to help inmates deal with trauma and challenges in their lives. He believed that many people committed crimes not because they were inherently bad, but because they lacked opportunities or didn't know how to cope with life's difficulties. These counseling sessions not only helped inmates understand themselves better, but also gave them the confidence and determination to change. John's reforms not only transformed the lives of the inmates, but also changed how they viewed the system. Initially, many inmates remained skeptical. They were used to injustice and abuse, so it was hard for them to believe that things would truly change. But as they saw the results of John's reforms, their trust gradually returned. A prisoner named Maria, who had once been denied medical care under Marcus and Henry, said, "I never thought I'd be treated like a human being in this prison, but now I feel like I have value, and I want to change so I never come back here again." It wasn't just the inmates. The honest guards also began to feel proud of their work. Previously, they had often been forced by Marcus and Henry to participate in wrongdoing or remain silent in the face of injustice. But now, they could work fairly and transparently, knowing they were contributing to building a better system. Thomas, a guard who had supported John during the investigation, shared, "For the first time in years, I feel proud of my job. I no longer have to turn a blind eye to wrongdoing. Now, I know I'm doing the right thing." The changes in the prison not only benefited the inmates and guards, but also had a positive impact on the outside community. Inmates who were educated and trained in vocational skills had a better chance of finding jobs and rebuilding their lives after release. The rate of reoffending dropped significantly, and the community began to see the prison not just as a place of confinement, but as a place of transformation. John Carter, once a man wrongfully imprisoned, had now become a symbol of resilience and justice. He had not only changed the prison, but also changed how people viewed the legal system and the responsibilities of those in power. Though he knew the road ahead would still be challenging, John believed he had laid the foundation for a better future. The inmates, the guards, and even the outside community all felt the impact of the changes. The prison, once a symbol of injustice and violence, had now become a place of hope and opportunity. And all of this was made possible by the courage and determination of one man who never stopped fighting for justice and change. After months of relentless struggle, John Carter could finally look back on what he had achieved. The prison, once a symbol of injustice and abuse of power, had now become a place of hope and opportunity. But John knew that these changes couldn't remain confined within the prison walls. He believed that building a better society required the participation of the entire community. Therefore, he decided to organize a gathering with the community, where he could share the reforms implemented in the prison and inspire others about the importance of justice, perseverance, and compassion. The gathering was held in a large hall near the prison, capable of accommodating hundreds of attendees. John wanted the event to be more than just a presentation. He wanted it to be an opportunity to connect the community with those who had once been incarcerated. He believed that understanding and empathy between the two sides were key to breaking down prejudices and creating a supportive environment for those seeking to rebuild their lives. John invited representatives from human rights organizations, government officials, journalists, and local residents. Most importantly, he also invited several former prisoners who had been released after participating in the prison's reform programs. These individuals, once symbols of mistakes and missteps, had now become living proof of the power of change. In the days leading up to the gathering, John and his team worked tirelessly to prepare. They organized speeches, prepared images and videos illustrating the changes in the prison, and planned interactive activities. John wanted people not just to hear, but to feel the significance of what he had accomplished. On the day of the gathering, the hall was packed with people. The atmosphere was both eager and solemn. When John stepped onto the stage, all eyes turned to him. He wore a simple suit, but his confident demeanor and determined gaze commanded everyone's attention. John began his speech by recounting his journey, from being wrongfully convicted and enduring the injustices of the prison system to standing up and fighting for change. He didn't shy away from sharing the hardships and pain he had endured, but he emphasized that those challenges had helped him realize the value of justice and compassion. Prisons are not just places to confine those who have committed crimes, John said, his voice strong and clear. They must be places that help people change, places that offer a second chance to those willing to make amends. But to achieve that, we need a fair system, and more importantly, we need understanding and support from the community. John went on to share the reforms he had implemented in the prison. He showed images and videos of the education programs, vocational training, and psychological counseling initiatives he had introduced. He also introduced some former prisoners who had turned their lives around thanks to these programs. A man named Luis, who had once been forced into hard labor, stepped onto the stage to share his story. "I thought my life was over," Luis said, his voice trembling with emotion. "But thanks to the opportunities I received in the prison, I learned a trade and found meaning in life again. Now I have a stable job and can take care of my family. It's all thanks to John Carter's perseverance and compassion." Luis's words moved the entire hall. Many people were brought to tears, and the atmosphere became warmer than ever. John looked around and saw empathy and hope in everyone's eyes, and he knew that his efforts had not been in vain. In the final part of the gathering, John emphasized three values he believed were fundamental to building a better society: justice, perseverance, and compassion. Justice is not just about punishing those who commit crimes, he said. It's about ensuring that everyone is treated fairly and given the opportunity to make amends. But justice cannot stand on its own. We need perseverance to protect it, even when faced with challenges and dangers. John paused for a moment, his gaze sweeping across the room. And finally, we need compassion. None of us are perfect. Everyone can make mistakes. But if we can look at each other with compassion, we can help one another overcome those mistakes and build a better future. John's words were met with resounding applause. Everyone in the hall, from officials to local residents, felt the power of his message. They didn't just see a man who had overcome adversity. They saw a true leader, someone willing to dedicate himself to bringing about change. As the gathering came to an end, John stepped out of the hall and stood in front of the prison gates. The evening sky was painted with the warm hues of sunset, creating a scene that was both peaceful and majestic. John looked up at the tall prison walls, the place that had once confined him and where he had begun his journey of transformation. In that moment, John felt an extraordinary sense of peace. He knew that the road ahead would still be full of challenges, but he was unafraid. He had learned that change didn't come from grand gestures, but from small, determined steps, and he was ready to keep moving forward, not just for himself, but for everyone who had believed in and supported him. John turned back to look at the hall, where people were still talking and sharing with one another. He saw Luis laughing and chatting with a group of people, and he knew that what he had done had not only changed one person's life, but had created a ripple effect, bringing hope to the entire community. With a determined gaze, John stepped forward, ready to face new challenges. He knew his journey was far from over, but he also knew he had created a new beginning, not just for himself, but for everyone who believed in the power of justice, perseverance, and compassion.